Subscribe and click the bell icon for the latest updates and notifications from the Indian Express.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pooja Pillai. I'm here on behalf of the Indian Express to welcome you to the latest edition of Express Adda, a series of informal conversations with newsmakers and opinion makers organized by the Indian Express Group. As many of you are aware, our past Express Adda guests have included such luminaries as the Dalai Lama, economist Amartya Sen, filmmaker Karan Johar, Olympic champ PV Sindhu, and writer Amitav Ghosh. This evening, our guest is Ruchir Sharma, author and global investor. Ruchir is currently head of emerging markets and chief global strategist at Morgan Stanley in New York. He's also a writer and has in fact been a writer longer than he has been an investor. He has contributed to the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Economic Times, and is currently a contributing opinion writer with the New York Times. Two of his books, Breakout Nations and The Rise and Fall of Nations, have top bestseller lists. And he recently came out with a third book called Democracy on the Road, a 25-year journey through India. He has had a long cherished travel of practicing around the country on just before any major national or state elections. And as I've recently learned, he arrived in Delhi this morning from his 28th such election trip. Ruchir will be in conversation today with Anand Goenka, Executive Director of Express Group, and Vandita Mishra, National Opinion Editor with the Indian Express. Vandita also, in fact, recently returned from her election travels, so we foresee a very interesting conversation this evening, just as we pull into the final stages of the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. May I please invite all three of you on the stage?
Thank you so much, Pooja. Ruchir, very warm welcome to the Adda. My first question is, how do we get onto this trip of yours? I think everybody wants to know this. No, really. By the way, I'm almost through the book. It's been really a wonderful read. I think let me start by asking you a question which I think will surprise many people in the audience here, that you say that democracy in India is thriving, it's alive and well, and it's only growing. And you see that more as you travel. So is democracy, I mean, why do you believe that democracy in India is actually thriving?
Right. So here's the thing, which is that, as you well know, that the incumbent in India, the government in power, has incredible advantages at its disposal. Like even in this election, if you look at it, by most estimates, the BJP is outspending the Congress party by 5 to 10 times as far as the spending is concerned. In general, it has an incredible cash machine. Most people have a perception that whichever government is in power typically tends to have a much greater hold over the media. There's also a perception that the government in power has so many institutions at its disposal, right? Whether it's got to do with the sort of, the intelligence services or in general, like a lot of institutions at its disposal. Despite these incredible advantages that any incumbent enjoys, the BJP does it incredibly now, and before that it was the various Congress governments or other governments. Despite those advantages that the incumbent enjoys, most incumbents in India lose elections. And for me, that is like something which is such a powerful statement, that no matter how much money you spend, no matter what you do in terms of controlling the institutions, at the end of the day, if the voter wants the government to lose, the government loses. So for me, that is such a reaffirming statement about the faith of democracy in this country. And that's not true. So if you look at most countries in the world, governments typically win re-elections. So, I mean, I had a look at this even in both the US and in across other countries. In the US, the president in his first term typically starts off the second term with an advantage of 6 to 7 percentage points in terms of the vote share for the second term. About 3/4 of governments in emerging markets win their re-election. So, these are really powerful stats. And in India, ever since we became a multi-party democracy in 1977, 2 out of 3 governments in India at both the national and the state level have lost their election. So for me, this is like such a sort of powerful statement that the world's largest democracy is thriving, and even this election, I feel, that it's so competitive. The fact that this election has become so competitive that the entire country seems obsessed with only one thing. How many seats will BJP get? How many seats will the Congress get? Any conversation you start with today is only about that. The fact that this election is still so unpredictable after a month into it, again tells you about how robust the democratic process in this country is.
So I'm going to resist the temptation of asking you whether anti-incumbency is working this time or not. We'll come to that later. I'm going to ask you something else. So we had a conversation ahead of the election campaign when you came to the Indian Express office. And I remember asking you whether this is going to be India's first national security election. I remember you saying that you doubted it very much because even after Kargil, that did not happen. But after that, you have traveled. I have traveled as well. And I think I asked the right question. Do you want to change your answer?
Absolutely not. You've been in Uttar Pradesh as well. We were there. We spent nearly a week in our travels on this election trip. And yes, somewhere deep down, there is a feeling that national security and there. But how often did you hear the word Balakot when you were out there?
No, I just want to add one thing.
Yeah.
I do not mean national security as in, is it an election where national security as an issue is being talked about deeply and widely? But I do mean a national security election in the sense that Rashtra Suraksha, Desh ka hit, Rashtra Suraksha figures again and again and again.
Right. So here's what I found in like Uttar Pradesh. I don't think this country has been this polarized at a caste, at a religion, at a region, and at a leader level as it is now. So, by the end of the trip, there was one big frustration. When we tried to ask some leaders, when we tried to ask the voters that who are you going to vote for, or it's so simple. Once you get their surname, you know exactly who they're going to vote for. There is absolutely no debate on that. I mean, I found this, I've not found such, we sort of want to believe here in the cities that we have moved towards being a post-caste world. That's what we want to believe. Instead, when we were on this trip, my finding was that we are basically in a post-truth world. And what do I mean by this? Which is this. There are a set, you can literally form a list of A and list of B. When you ask any upper caste voter, or you ask a non-OBC, like a non-Dalit OBC, or a non-Jatav scheduled caste person, who are you going to vote for? The answer is Modi. Without any shadow of doubt. You ask a Muslim, you ask a Yadav, you ask a Jatav, who are you going to vote for? Without a shadow of doubt, it is Mahagathbandhan. It's as simple as that. Now when it comes to issues, if you ask any person what the issues are, the person voting for the BJP will point out how good the things are over the last 5 years. You ask them what? They will tell you in terms of that we've been given a toilet, Izzat Ghar as they call it, when you travel in these places. They will tell you that how we have got electricity, how we have got better roads, and national security will come up. That's the like the key list that they'll tell you. You go ask the same question to a Yadav, a Muslim, or a Jatav, and they will tell you exactly the opposite. They will tell you we have got nothing, basically. That Modi hasn't done anything for us, this hasn't happened, that hasn't happened, this hasn't happened. So it's like, what exactly is the truth? You don't know what the truth is because people are picking on facts which are convenient for them. Same thing with demonetization and GST. So that's what I find amazing, that this issue, there is no, this election, there is no discussion of issues because the issues have been decided by your caste.
You did not think that Modi had made himself the issue this election?
No, as I said, that yes, he has. As I said, but the polarization is happening at multiple levels. It's happening at a caste level, it's happening at a religious level, and it's happening at a leader level. So yes, it's there. But and I found it like amazing that the Mahagathbandhan, we all sort of grew up thinking about the hostility between, at the village level, between the Jativs and the Yadavs. But in every rally we went to, or in every sort of meeting we have, they're completely coexisting now, completely cohabiting. So the fact that there's such seamless transfer taking place between these two communities, for me, was like a fascinating sort of insight as we traveled.
But do you think the opposition then is at a major disadvantage that it doesn't have a national face, a national figure quite like Modi?
No, I think that yes, I think that's true, that it's true in certain states. As I write in the book as well, somewhat facetiously but somewhat seriously, that you go to Tamil Nadu, you go to Andhra Pradesh, there people actually ask you Modi who, Rahul who. There's almost a sort of, disdain for the national leaders. I think in this election, the south of India has been grossly ignored and also underestimated. We have a tendency, because of the Delhi centricity, of talking a lot about the Hindi heartland. So in the Hindi heartland, he is undoubtedly the issue. And undoubtedly, in places like Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh and other places, he has been able to, he's single-handedly pulling the BJP up. The question to ask is that if Modi was not the leader of the BJP, it's quite possible that the BJP's share or vote share would be down further. So, but to say that he's single-handedly the issue, no. I mean, as I said, that as far as UP is concerned, I found it fascinating that it's all about the caste. So even last time, people forget this, that last time, the vote share of the Mahagathbandhan was in fact greater, slightly, about equal, but slightly greater, I think, than the vote share of the BJP, even in 2014. So to say this election is all about Modi may be a bit of an exaggeration.
But did you also not see that even the Mahagathbandhan is not the same everywhere? For instance, the Mahagathbandhan, at least according to what I saw, is much weaker in Bihar than it is in UP. So it's not, the pushback to Modi and national security in Bihar is not as much as it is in UP.
Yeah, I didn't travel to Bihar, but that's what I get to hear. But even in, it's about vote shares, that the combined vote share of the BJP and the JDU in Bihar is much greater than the combined vote share of the Gathbandhan that has been stitched together like in Bihar. So this is all about as simple arithmetic as this.
What is, you mentioned in the book that you had almost a fanboy moment when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister, and generally, I think, with the Gandhi family. And then you had a long conversation with Sonia Gandhi. And was Rahul in that room, or was it only Sonia Gandhi? I'm not sure.
Yeah, both of them. So like 2002.
2002. And then something happened after that conversation. And are you fanboy still? Are you no longer fanboy?
No, I've made a rule, basically, like after that meeting, which is never meet political leaders in India on a one-on-one basis, because then you cannot objectively analyze them and you cannot objectively write about them. So, like ever since then, I've met them in group settings, but I've never met them on a one-on-one basis. I try and avoid that completely, both parties and stuff like that. The instance that you're mentioning to me, mentioning here is in 2002, like when I went up and so here I was, still a bit idealistic, maybe still a bit naive, sort of in the hope. I was 28 then, still in the hope that maybe India can come up with this free market reformer who can transform this country in terms of, because the question which has always bedeviled me growing up is that we got our political freedom so early, why don't we get our economic freedom, right? I mean, as you know, as a business person, that it's very difficult in this country still to do business. So my sort of dream was that why don't we get political freedom also sort of, like economic freedom follows political freedom. So I went up and, I got an hour with them to make a presentation as to what sort of free market reforms India should follow, and especially in 2002 when the Congress seemed a bit out in the wilderness. I spoke about that, and I got complete radio silence after that meeting. And after that, I've not had any one-on-one meetings, with them, because I think that the fundamental DNA of Indian politicians is socialist. And that's my realization, and statist. And that's been my realization of the last 5 years as well. I mean, the fact that you could do something like demonetization, for a person who was heralded to be sort of like a great reformer, to do something like demonetization, that is such an oppressive statist move to do. And so, therefore, my sort of realization is that in India, whatever reforms will come will happen at a state-by-state level, at a central level to get any big top-down macro reform and stuff like that. So I was thinking of my next piece to write, part of my New York column, Times column, and I was already thinking of the title, that to win an election in India, you have to be Bernie Sanders, which is that, basically, you have to be a socialist to win an election in India.
To get you back to this election, so one thing that one heard voters say over and over again across places was कि भारत का मान सम्मान international stage पे बढ़ गया है, that प्रतिष्ठा international global उसमें बढ़ गया है. Now, many Indians seem to think that 5 years of Modi has somehow elevated India's stature in the world. You are a global investor, you roam the world, you work out of New York. Does the world look at India differently?
I have to say something, and this has been personally very disappointing for me. And like, this is a bit of a reality check. The interest in India today and in this Indian election is extremely low. And I know that's like directly, one cheat sheet I do is that every time I write a column, like for the international media, I always check that how's it doing? Is it trending well? And we all follow these metrics now that, how is it doing? Every time I write about India, I get virtually it never makes the most popular list or the trending list. So it's almost, for me, there's a disincentive to write about India for the international audience because the interest in this election is very low. I wrote this book, and I had a discussion with some, my US agent and stuff like that, and he was so clear about one thing. Please don't bring this book to America. So I'm like, I've written this book, why shouldn't I bring this to America? And he just gave me the stuff, and he's a legendary sort of agent. He's like about the best in the business, I think. He told me that, listen, your last 2 books sold XY, it made it to the New York Times bestseller, whatever. The chance that an India book will ever make it there is 0. So basically, we don't want to sort of, have your sort of graph go, all the way down. So don't bring it here in terms of it. And then I've spoken to, so everyone's doing their check the box story about India. But unfortunately, the interest in India and the Indian election is really low abroad just now. So that is just a reality check in terms of what happened. Now again, very interesting that you mentioned this, that many Indians feel that. Again, it's the complete polarization. The people who like Modi will point you to that. The people who don't like him will point you to the other stuff which he hasn't done. So to talk about anything like many Indias anymore is just become very, or many Indians anymore has become very difficult.
But generally, the foreign press's view on Modi, I mean, is it positive? Is it negative? I mean, The Economist now for the second time has sort of asked India not to re-elect Modi.
No, it's turned. I mean, I have to say that, and in terms of, I'm part of, I can say so very openly that one of my more embarrassing columns, if I can say so, was after the 2014 election. I was writing those days for the Wall Street Journal regularly. So they asked me to do their post-election, the post-election piece on the day he was elected. And the title that we gave that piece, it was their main op-ed that day, was India's Reagan moment, right? And the US press liked it, the Republican senators caught it, and basically Republican moment, etc., because I sort of projected my biases by saying he's talking minimum government, maximum governance. I projected that bias to say that he's going to basically, sort of be a reform. This is for the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal is very practical that way. They're very much economically right-wing, and they were willing to overlook all the other stuff, which was going on, which the other sort of classic liberal crowd was thing. They also wrote a very big editorial backing it. This is Modi's moment, keying off this op-ed that I had written for them. They wrote their piece just now, their editorial just now, and it was a very tough editorial as far as the government's concerned. So that tells you about how sentiment has swung, that the international media, by and large, across the spectrum, the New York Times, what sort of pieces they've been carrying, but across the spectrum, the international media has turned on Modi in a very big way. When he came to power in 2014, forget The Economist. I'm using the Wall Street Journal as being the weather vane here. That how they have switched dramatically tells you about the way the international media has changed their impression as far as Modi is concerned.
They've changed their impression of Modi, but how successful do you think they are at calling it? I think
No. I mean, like as I said, that that way, I think that, you ask the BJP people that and they rightly dismiss it about saying that who reads this, etc. We just met, we were in Varanasi, just in the lobby, we met a senior minister there, and we were pointing out to the story that, about Ram Madhav made some comment to Bloomberg about the fact that maybe they need alliances. And he rightly dismissed it by saying that who reads Bloomberg and stuff like that. And of course, now that's the thing. But that is the truth, that these publications don't really make any impact here. But since you asked the question, I think there's been a massive switch in opinion here.
You also went to West Bengal
Yes.
on your 28th trip, and I saw somewhere that you were quoted as saying that in such a compressed time frame, the strides that the BJP has made and the decline of the left you stunned. So tell us a little about that.
Yeah, no, I can't remember any other instance, and you're sort of as good a political observer as any, where such a dramatic change has taken place, where one party which ruled the state for 30 years has virtually disintegrated. And the BJP's vote share has surged, that even in the 2016 assembly elections, we had gone there. I think their vote share was about 10% at that election. And in this election, their vote share will at least be 30%. Now, for that to happen in a state is huge. And that to me, is a big surprise, because as you know, mostly like in India, it's the same merry-go-round. Like the same parties come to power, go out of power, wait for their turn, come back, and the merry-go-round continues. But for me, this was really stunning, in terms of what's going on, and also tells you that that could be a model for the future, that a party which was non-existent in the state goes from 10% vote share in the 2016 election to more than 30%, and a party that ruled the state for 30 years virtually disintegrates in terms of what happened. So that for me was a real observation in terms of what's going on out here, and whether it's social media or whether it's the polarized environment, what's causing this? Because otherwise, very rarely does this happen in a large state. Yeah, small states like Delhi maybe, but in large states, to see a party disintegrate after ruling for 30 years and have a new party come and sort of take over the main opposition space in such a short span of time, that was quite remarkable.
Was there any other such remarkable and striking change that you saw in your travels this time?
No, as I said, that for me, I get criticized a lot, even in the book. If there's any pushback, it was that, oh, you're, promoting caste. You're talking too much about caste, the importance of caste. And yet in UP, when we went, I felt the caste lines were as solid as they have ever been. I can't think, that's all that people wanted to speak to us about in terms of, the moment you knew the caste, you knew exactly what they're going. You knew exactly what issues they're going to talk to you about. It was as simple as that. And so therefore, this election's become so hard to call because there's such polarization on both sides.
I, by the way, got back this afternoon from Bihar. So my first little bit of my sort of Bihar election experience. But I completely agree with you. It's just about sort of leader and what caste and what the percentages are. And it's actually shocking, but also, I guess, in a sense, makes the political leaders very lazy because they're not doing much except for representing that sort of caste.
I have to say something. My respect for political leaders has gone up dramatically over time, partly because I tell you something, that to be out there in this heat, just a word for them, to be out there in this heat, campaigning for 14 hours a day, addressing 8 rallies. We saw Mamta's rally in Barakpur there. She walks off the stage. She is literally drenched in sweat. And here we are basically trying to find the best shade, the best, how do you stop. And I must digress here because a lot of the group members are here, but I'll just tell you about how the heat plays a role. We have about 20 of us in our group of travelers, and there are 4 kinds of people in our group. So you have the first kind of people that when a car stops, they actually go out and ask questions of people. You have a second group which sort of, the moment the cars stop, they find a shade spot and they start speaking with each other, amongst each other. So in fact, on one of the trips that happened that I got out, I told some of these people, what are you doing? Why are you speaking with each other? Go speak with some of the voters. So one of them went and spoke with one of the voters, and basically that so-called voter replied, साहब मैं तो आपका ड्राइवर हूं, मैं 4 दिन से आपके साथ घूम रहा हूं. Then you had the third category, which is that it's so hot. It's so hot that they literally call the voters to the car from the window. Like the AC is running, they open the door, कि आप आइए बताइए हमें क्या हो रहा है. Then we have a fourth very interesting category, also present in this room, which actually go out of the car and actually go and lecture the voter which way to vote. आप मतलब ऐसे vote देंगे मतलब, you know, like, didn't this happen? Even like in Varanasi yesterday, it happened that one of the, like, I mean, like this person went out and was talking to a Muslim person, and this person was complaining, as always, that is gali mein ye nahi hua, is gali mein ye kaam nahi hua. It was a Pathan tola, as they call it, like a Pathan tola. And she was lecturing him. नहीं नहीं, ये मोदी की गलती नहीं है, ये तो BMC की गलती है, आप BMC को कमिश्नर, you know, जाके बोलिए. So anyway, so we have four kinds of people in our car. And I'm just telling you that to avoid the heat, a lot of them either sit inside the car and call the people, or when they go out, they stand in like the shade. So my respect for politicians has gone up dramatically because you see the way that they're out there slogging for these elections. It is incredible the number of hours that they're putting in. And you know, one thing more which I've said, that these politicians don't have any personal lives, I feel. And that's why one of the sort of stat that I've quoted in the book and also written about is that 1/3 of all the political leaders in India today are single and unattached. Now, in a country which there's so much social pressure to marry, to sort of be single and like unattached, I think, you know, like says a lot. And the other thing which and this is what my American editors found really remarkable, you know, when I was just telling this to them, is that the lack of complete sort of personal lives, that you can walk into people's bedrooms virtually when the leaders meet you. Often they'll meet you in their bedrooms. I mean, I quote the anecdote in the book in 2002 of Mayawati calling in, you know, basically like in the morning, she's there, you know, she calls you inside and it's virtually like her large bedroom and stuff like that. And then very sort of endearing, I mean, like she tells you, aap log baithiye, main abhi Colgate karke aati hu. You know, so that's just the way it is.
One of the things that you said in the book also, which I have experienced in my whatever little rural travel that I've done, is it's just how hospitable everybody is. Not just Mayawati, not just the leaders, but I mean any, you know, even the most poor village, even if you go into their home, they'll welcome you in and they'll offer you something. And is that something you've...
It is so right.
Yeah, just to add to that, you've also said that you were struck by how completely safe you feel traveling in the most remote parts of villages. Despite the fact that we have such an unemployment problem, yet it has not converted into crime or social unrest in the way that it has in other countries.
Yeah, you know, like as I've said, that when that even now when I travel to Brazil, I travel to South Africa, I think twice, you know, before getting out of my hotel room, which way to go, what to do and stuff. In most Indian small towns and cities, we have a habit as the group that we go on these post-prandial walks, which is post-dinner walks. And it's fine. Apart from the occasional stray dog who comes after you, you basically feel safe as far as traveling, I mean, at these places are concerned. But the hospitality thing is incredible. It's you know, like it's basically like a code of love, you know, that they want to sort of feed you and stuff like that. Like, you know, so we had this amazing footage that we got yesterday that we were like in this district near Chandoli, outside of Varanasi, and there was a wedding going on, a little wedding procession, and they saw us and we were talking and they wanted us to be part of the wedding, and some of us started dancing along with them and stuff like that. But the most remarkable anecdote of hospitality I'll tell you was in Bihar, since you've come from there. This was in October 2010. We had gone to cover the elections there. And this was one of those evenings which we'll remember for both the right and wrong reasons. So the first thing that happened that evening was that we went to, you know, we were called for to meet Lalu Prasad Yadav. And he was his usual self, and the samosas at his place are called singhadas. They're really huge, basically. So he served us the samosas and everything, and his usual sort of joking with us, he, you know, like as if he can't remember the, you know, who his fourth son is and stuff like that. You know, like he was doing that. Our next meeting is with Nitish Kumar. The moment we go there, there's a whole plate which is served out to us. Now, we can't tell Nitish Kumar that Lalu just gave us samosas. We can't eat your, you know, your cutlets and stuff. And so we were forced to sort of eat that, and people were flattening it out on their plate and things. And then our third regular host is Anuradha's brother. I mean, like in terms of Ravi Shankar Prasad, you know, I mean, in terms of there. And, you know, like very sort of nice and courteous, and always makes gets his litta choki, right, which is done out there. And so we have litti choki, and we have to have that, basically, choka. We have to have that when we are there. So basically, by the time we had to have that, it was pretty tough. but how do you say no? So yeah, food is just, that's the first thing which comes out to you.
So you said there is something about India and single leaders, but across the globe, you've also said that the average age of leaders is going up, and that there is a dissonance there of sorts with the fact that we live in this age of social media explosion and tech savviness, and yet the average age of leaders is going up. Why do you think that is?
I know, that's one of the sort of mystifying things as to why is that exactly going on. Are people hankering more for experience, that they want more experience? Because even in this election, if there's any advantage Modi has versus Rahul, whenever people make that comparison in a few places, it is about experience, it is about who can handle the nation at a time which is more sensitive. So I think that maybe it's got to do with that sort of rising nationalism also comes with the fact that, okay, we want someone, who's basically sort of, been there for a while. I mean, I'm guessing. I really don't have a proper answer to that.
And you've also mentioned the WhatsApp explosion. How does the WhatsApp explosion change politics?
Well, the first time
And
we
elections.
saw, yeah, I mean, the first time we saw this was 2014. So, and we all know that so much of the fake news has now, every time now we get a WhatsApp, like we're all sort of, so on this trip also, there was some poll being circulated by The Economist in terms of, what the seat projections were. The first instinct is to distrust the WhatsApp, thinking this must be a fake poll which they have done until someone actually sends you the screenshot and someone does that. So yeah, I think that it's there. But the only thing which I'll say is that the battle there is more matched now. In 2014, when we went on the trips, at that point in time, there was absolutely no comparison between the BJP social media campaign and the opposition's. The BJP still has a much more powerful social media sort of campaign today, but the opposition, I think, has caught on to it. So the social media has also become more commoditized now compared to what was the case 5 years ago.
Ruchir, you said that most of the reform has happened in times of crisis in India, and often that is when there are more coalition governments than strong governments. Yet, I think, from my assessment, corporate India seems to want strong governments.
What corporate India tells you in public and tells you in private are two different stories, as you well know. I've basically done this. I used to do these budget shows in India. And every time, as people like here, yeah, as you will know, Isha, that every time a budget show would get over, I mean, be on air, you'd have these guys 9 on 10, 10 on 10. I've in fact have one guy who said 11 on 10, like to suck. And the moment the cameras go off, basically the bitching starts, the non-stop, things start. So I would heavily discount what corporate India says in public and what they say in private. You know it, that in terms of in private. So this idea that what they are saying in public, I would heavily discount that.
But globally, generally there is a notion that businesses want strong, stable governments that are sort of decisive.
Yeah, but I'd say that in terms of that's what their instinct is. But I don't think that's what there's no empirical evidence to back this up in terms of what happens. I think that coalition governments are a real. Like I've always said that politics, is the downstream of culture, and when you have a very heterogeneous country, whether it's got to do with Canada or some of the countries in Europe, you'll always have coalition governments. So I think coalition governments is a reflection of your society, of your heterogeneity. And that's why, in fact, one of the pieces I've recently written is that India can never be a China. This whole comparison, because China is a very homogeneous society. What they can do as top-down reform, or Confucius societies in East Asia can do, India can never do, because we are such a heterogeneous country that whenever we have tried heavy centralization, like Indira Gandhi, there's always been a backlash, and it's always torn the social fabric of this country. So I think that what businesses may say, but the reality of the country is that if we try too much centralization, I feel that's going to tear the social fabric of this country.
So do you still think that this is going to be an election of 29 different elections?
Broadly, yes. I mean, that's what we discussed last time. Broadly, yes. Now, of course, it is true that in some places, Modi effect is much more dominant than the other parts. In the Hindi heartland, his effect is much more dominant. You go outside the Hindi heartland to south of India, it's not. So you have some of those broad themes. But yeah, I think that, like in this election, we're all back to doing state-by-state numbers. Like in 2014, it was about, roughly what the sort of wave is. In the end, he got even more seats than what people thought. But I don't think that the state-by-state was being done like the way it's being done in this election. I think most people are doing that. I mean, if you ask me, most serious political analysts are doing this state by state.
Are we getting close to getting a prediction from you now, or?
We have done 28 election trips. Of the 27 election trips that we have done, and I've documented this in the book, we have got the direction, the group has got the direction right about 26 times, the direction right. The numbers we have never ever been able to nail.
Which are the two you got wrong?
One, I said,
20, okay,
yeah, like
so one.
20, because this we'll know our result
We'll
on the
know it later,
23rd.
right. So which is the one you got wrong?
This was Rajasthan in 2003. We went there for the state assembly election, and again tells you about how the biases play in your head. Ashok Gehlot that year was being feted as the best chief minister of this country. He was on the cover of India Today and stuff like that, that this is the Mr. Development man. We went there with that bias, we drove on the roads, we sort of, the roads seemed great, did that. Most of us came back thinking that he's going to come back, and that was a wrong call. But otherwise, generally the direction we've got wrong, including in 2004 when the India Shining campaign was happening. Still remember us coming back at 4 in the morning after a very rough drive from Kanpur. One of the worst drives that we have had was from Etawah to back here, and figuring out that maybe this India Shining is a bit of a bubble. And we sort of had that, but no one had the guts then to basically call for the fact that the Congress would get more seats than the BJP. Right. So, but the direction you get right. So I think that as far as this election is concerned, I can broadly tell you what the group's thinking is in terms of what the broad, because I know that's the one, it's the conversation starter everywhere, that how many seats. It's become like the standard parlor game. Broadly, the thinking of the group, so we sit down on the last night of the election trip. It is tradition for the entire group to sit down, and basically it's a very hard-fought sort of contest. Everyone, like a school exam, you're sort of putting your arm to hide what number you're putting, etc., until you actually put the number in. That we put our predictions down and we come up with a average number, or what the 20 of us think. So the broad thing was that the average number for the group basically had the BJP sort of going down to about 215 or so in terms of what the average was, BJP alone, and the Congress going up to about 95 or so. That was the average number of the group. But I would seriously, so that's the broad direction in terms of the way the things are moving. But I feel that I would not put any credibility much on this number this time, because the election can look so different, as a couple of pollsters in our group will sort of tell you, like Prannoy and Dorab, that if the BJP gets 1% more votes than what we think, the number goes up to 230. The BJP gets 1% less, the number goes to 200 or less. And the way the election result is perceived is so different. The BJP gets 230 or plus, it's basically like a government being re-elected. If the BJP drops below 200, all of a sudden it's open sesame in terms of what could the next scenario for this country be, in terms of who forms the government. So I feel that this is the most competitive election I have seen of the ones we have traveled to, in terms of what's going to happen. It is extremely uncertain, and I would not hang my hat on an exact number, because 1%, now, you travel so much. Can you actually predict which way that 1% is going to go you want? And in UP, the biggest election, the biggest issue for me, like one thing we just can't, seem to fathom is that what effect is Priyanka Gandhi having? We had a long meeting with her when we were there, off the record, in terms of it. And, like you get to hear some people telling you that, Murda party ko zinda kar diya and stuff, but yet, we didn't see many people talk about the Congress. But I think that if the BJP ends up winning this election, they can virtually send a thank you card to her. I'll tell you why. Because of the fact that if by any chance the BJP has a big, if the Congress has a, let's say like a meaningful vote share increase in UP, it'll come from the Mahagathbandhan's vote bank. So, it's such a difficult election to call that, and if that does not happen, then the Mahagathbandhan has the edge. The Mahagathbandhan, the MGP will get more seats than the BJP. How do you predict that? How do you know that in terms of how much will the Congress vote share increase? So it's one of those curveballs that her entry may have helped at the margin, the Congress, but may end up swinging the election the BJP's way. It's such a hard election to call.
When you say it's a very competitive election and that you have not seen this competitive an election, who is giving competition to Modi and Modi's narrative? Is it a party, or would you just say alliances?
Yeah, it's basically, again, like in different states are different stuff. Like in Bengal, it's like, what a match.
But among the parties, who strikes you as actually standing up to the Modi challenge?
It's not a one party, because the Congress party is not the party it used to be, right? So the Congress party is not able to do this. In fact, if anything, like in the states like Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, typically in these states, after having won assembly elections just a few months ago, the Congress should, based on past history, be winning, like, in fact, a good chunk of the seats in these states. I don't think anyone thinks that's going to happen. That tells you about how powerful the Modi effect is. Yes, they will win some seats because the BJP maxed out last time, but not the kind of seats that you expected in the past. So, therefore, I don't know as to which one party you can say is giving them. But every state you go, and it's a different match that the BJP is sort of meeting. I mean, like in Bengal, it's such a hard-fought battle in term. But one of the things I point in the book is that Indian leaders tend to be such poor orators in general, right? In terms of they just don't. Whether it's Mayawati, it's Jayalalitha, it's Mulayam, it's Naveen Patnaik, generally poor orators typically. And Modi has a big advantage there because he's such a masterful orator. But look at the one person who is able to almost do that is Mamta. That she was able to sort of, the way her sort of speeches are like able to electrify the crowd as well. So it's state by state, really, which party, which leader is giving him a fight.
But the rise of the right-wing populist, it's not just in India that we are seeing this. It's a global trend, a global phenomenon. How do you see that panning out? Are we peaking there? Is it continuing? Or you think it's coming down?
I think the rise of nationalism is a very long-term trend. And I think this links into like a theme that I wrote about in my previous book about deglobalization. So if you look at the world today, what happened was this, that in the 1930s and the 1940s, there was a massive period of countries turning inward. Then you had a period of globalization in the 80s, 90s, and 2000. And what's globalization? Let me just define it. When people trade much more with each other, when there are more capital flows between countries, and when there are more migrant flows between countries. This decade, they've all been going in reverse. Trade volumes between countries is shrinking, capital flows between countries is shrinking, and so are migrant flows.
And you've said Trump is a symptom of this, not
exactly,
a cause.
Exactly. Trump is a symptom of that. He was able to capitalize on that. So I think that this is very much a global trend, and the rise of nationalism is a natural fallout at a time when you have deglobalization, that you have much, that you have much more sort of clinging on to national identities.
Also, democracy seems to be written about as to be regressing in a sense, or sort of retreating, but not in India, clearly.
No, but these are pendulum swings. Like, for example, one thing which is fascinating in America, is that socialism is on the rise. So if the number of youngsters who say that they would rather have socialism is going up on the rise. And this is because many people have ended up, like in America, haven't seen what socialism is all about. So for them, socialism is an idealistic thing, and therefore the Democrat Party has leaders like Bernie Sanders. I mean, even the last election, the thought of a Bernie Sanders having a chance of winning an election in America was laughable. The fact that he has even a remote chance today or a chance today tells you what's going on. So these are pendulum swings. What happened here was that many people, including in our group, used to be very sort of socialists when they were growing up. But because they saw the ill effects of socialism, they became much more free market. In America, it's going the other way, that the young people there haven't seen what socialism is about, and they are seeing the downside of having unfettered capitalism, where they can't sort of get paid as much because corporates have a lot of power, their bargaining power is not that much, and they haven't seen. So their romanticism is with social. So for me, these are pendulum swings which happen, which is that an ideology gets too far. Like across the world, it was considered completely lunatic or even heretical to speak anything against free trade. Free trade was the ultimate thing. Now people are seeing that, yeah, you can have a lot of free trade, you can have a lot of globalization, but that has a negative effect on the social fabric of a country. What do you do about that? Something needs to be done about that. And even in India, like in Bengal, this entire issue of allowing a free flow of migrants is something which is resented by the local populace. It's just a reality, because you can't think about, we should have an open door and everybody should be allowed in. The social fabric also matters. And I think that's what some of the technocrats and some of these people who got too carried away by the wave of globalization have underestimated, and now the pendulum is swinging the other way incrementally.
You've also, beyond the election, you've said that one of the big risks that India faces is competitive populism. And this competitive populism was okay, all right, in the last decade when the global economy was on the up and up, and India was part of that, all, as other emerging economies were. But now that that period has ended, this poses a real threat. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Look at this election too, which is that every state you go, very few people actually go out there and speak about the development they've done. Instead, they talk about the number of freebies they've given, the number of schemes that they have launched. And we know the economy is not growing the way it was growing, when the global economy was booming last decade. So then it becomes much more difficult for you to go out there and do this kind of stuff. And for me, this is also somewhere where our development priorities are warped. Like coming back to the current election, in Uttar Pradesh, as you well know, the single biggest issue which we haven't spoken about, but on which Amin is there, has to do with the entire stray cattle issue. There's been so much discussion about the political fallout of the ban on cow slaughter. Not enough on how it has completely disturbed the entire ecosystem of an economy. It has had a massively negative effect on the ecosystem of the economy. Now, the government there is being forced to spend more and more on building more cow sheds because there's some way of protection. Now, should that be our development priority in this country, that we don't have money to spend on infrastructure in terms of roads and bridges? That's what China did at this stage of its development. And instead, we are now spending money on building like cow sheds. That is something which I find is there. And no political party is willing to say that, let's go back the other way. We discussed this with Akhilesh, etc. It's become a holy cow issue. You can't talk about it now. So for me, that is the problem here, which is that once you let out, like the genie's out of the bottle, as far as populism is concerned, it's very hard to put it back in. And that for me is the big risk if you are, over the next few years.
Richard, on the one hand, you're saying we can't compare India with China. And on the other hand, you're saying that we need to also be conscious of social fabric. Things like cows, etc., have become those kind of things that are sort of, socially now sort of have that relevance. You've spoken a lot about alliances. At the end of the day, somebody's got to make a call between development, social fabric, and for that you need some decision making. In this Mahagathbandhan, with so many different factors, so many different huge egos and personalities, do you think it's a functional model for it to work, even if they were to win?
See, I have no idea in terms of whether they'll win, but I'll say this about India. There are two or three things here. One, that the private sector of this country is still very robust, despite all the problems which have happened. In fact, we have done this work that no other developing country produces as many good companies as India does, in terms of the number of fast-growing good companies with good return on equity. Now, there's a lot of junk garbage which we hear about all the time, but that's one. Our base is very low. Our per capita income is only $2,000. At this stage, China was growing at 10, 11%. We'll never get there, but can we do 6, 7 at this stage? Yes. And the third thing I'll say is this, and this is where I think even Mr. Modi has changed. When we used to meet him, until we had a couple of episodes where we didn't, in 2007 and stuff, he would speak a lot about empowering the states. Give the states as much power as possible. But the moment you come to the center, you stop doing that. Because then you want to centralize as much control as possible. So I'd say that, I don't know what the makeup will be, but maybe one upside of having coalitions is it gives the states more power to develop. Gives state chief ministers more power that you do what you want to do on labor laws, land laws, you do what people want to do. I think giving states more power may be one upside of having a more coalition-based government. But for me, as I said, it's about keeping in mind the social fabric, that whenever this country has tried too much centralization, including with the Congress government in the 70s and 80s, it's always had a negative effect. So for me, that's not too much even of a choice.
You spoke about caste earlier. So caste is a problem because it predetermines your responses. It makes issues irrelevant in a certain sense. But there is an argument that many people say, put forward, which is that you have communalism on one side and you have casteism on the other. And caste can actually be a good thing because it can puncture the monolith that the communal narrative seeks to construct. So would you say casteism is actually the only robust counter to communalism, and that may be a good thing?
I don't have a value judgment on this. All I'm trying to say is that this is the reality of India. That we in the urban elite, even here among my friends, if I were to make a joke about what their caste is, they get completely offended by it. But so my point is that this is the reality as far as India is concerned. This is not a value judgment. And you're right, it's possible. So if this is the reality of India, it's the reality of India. There's no point in us fighting against it. Yes, it does seem that the more urban we become, the caste influences tend to fade, right? Because the more in the cities and stuff, it tends to fade. So yes, but I think that in this election, if anything, in UP, I think the caste factor is as big as I've ever seen it, and it's a state which has always been very caste-based.
So you spoke about cities and how they, in a sense, caste disintegrates a bit in the city. But that's, again, India's failure. We don't have tier 2 cities, new cities coming up in the way that, for instance, China, we had
Very
so
true.
many new cities.
Absolutely.
So where do you see this going, and what does it take, what will it need for urbanization to become a bigger issue in India?
I mean, as I said, it's as much decentralization as possible. So this is a study that I have done to see that how many new cities have come up in China and how many new have come up in India, and defining new as cities where the population sort of increases to 1 million or so. And like in India, we could hardly find any new cities in the last 20 years which have come up, where the population has surged. I mean, a lot in a completely new place where the population used to be 100,000 or something and gone above 1 million. In China, there have been about, I think, if I remember correctly, because it's from my previous book, about 20 such cities which have come up in terms of like the surge. For me, this is much more about decentralization, which is that, see, at the state chief minister also, they don't give more power beyond that. So it's about, like the municipal corporations and all. The more power you keep devolving, the more chances you have of getting these bottom up to create new cities out of thin air. That just doesn't happen.
Should we break for some questions to the audience? Can we get our hands up, and if you could please introduce yourself before you ask the first question? All the way at the back seems to be the first question. Just wait for a mic, please, and introduce yourself. Somebody getting a mic there to the back?
So,
I think it's on. It's on.
I'm VN Dalmia Ruchir. Good evening. So I'm an admirer. I enjoy reading your pieces. Now, yesterday, Ruchir, there was this article by Arti Jayarath, having just come back from UP, an extensive tour of UP, in which she said that one of her primary observations was that the BJP worker is invisible in UP. She also observed that, flex boards, hoardings were much lesser as compared to the noise and visibility of previous elections. And her conclusion was that it's so much an election about Modi and non-Modi that the merit or demerit and the promotion of the local candidate has become less important. But if it's true that the BJP worker is invisible, then was that also your observation?
I'm not sure what you mean by invisible, because I think that as far as, we would meet people from the RSS and stuff, like some random people there. So this word invisible, I'm not being able to kind of relate to. I think that you're right, that people are fighting like even the candidates will tell you in these constituencies that they're fighting the election on the back of Modi, because otherwise there'll be a lot of anti-incumbency against the candidate as such, because of the way that, and most people told us that Modi's popularity amongst the BJP is way higher than that of the candidate or the chief minister in UP throughout. So that's true, that I think that the election is being fought, as far as Modi is concerned, but to say that the worker is invisible, I mean, I don't quite relate to that, to be honest with you.
Question in the front, please. Get a mic in the front.
Hi, Ruchir.
Hi.
Okay, so how much does election funding play a role in this particular election? There's been a lot written about election bonds and how they favored one party over another. And clearly one party seems to have spent more than the other. So what's your take on this whole
I think you missed
situation?
it, like in the opening I mentioned that, which is the fact that the role of money in elections, according to me, is way exaggerated. Because, as I said, that the incumbent always way outspends because they have the powers and the resources to get the money. But they way outspend the opposition, and yet, more often than not, the opposition wins rather than loses elections in India. So I'd say that money is a factor, maybe, but its role is way exaggerated. And that's what I feel, that even in this election, it's there. But yeah, the statistic which I think most of you know about is, and I mean, I still find it very remarkable, so I'll repeat it, is that like studies have been done to show that the total spending in India's election campaign this time is greater than the US election campaign of 2016. That in the US election campaign in 2016, I think it's opensecrets.org basically, which tabulated the number was about $6.5 billion. For both the presidential and the congressional election, the total spend. And the estimates for this election that I've read on India, which some people have tried to do the study, again, it's very hard because a lot of it here is not transparent like there. The estimates are close to $8 billion. So like for me, this is remarkable. I still remember this sort of, again, like we tend to remember anecdotes more than even numbers, that in 2009, and I have this anecdote in the book as well, that we are sitting in Andhra Pradesh and we are basically having a chat with some candidate and he's going through the math about how much the election is costing. And this is in the, like the depths of the crisis. In early 2009, we had gone to cover that election. And I remember what, this is like one of our group members, Dorab Supariwala, who I quote in the book, in fact, by saying, he looked at the math and he said, India does not need QE, right? There's no need for quantitative easing in India. The election funding will be enough to basically lift India's GDP. So that was a bit of an exaggeration. But the fact that we, with a per capita income, which is 1/25th of that of America, and an economy which is 1/10 the size of America, or nearly 1/10, is going to spend more on a national election than what America spent in 2016, to me tells you a lot about how much money is thrown at the polls.
Get a mic on the third row there, please.
Thank you. My name is Syed Iqbal Hasnan, and I compliment on your book. It is a very honest book, and I say very honestly, it should be read by all Indian politicians. It must be in there. It is very important for them, actually.
Thank you.
So, coming back to this election, I would like to ask you that this election is fought on a muscular prime minister and nationalism versus Gadbandhan and subnationalism, as we saw how the Mamta is projecting subnationalism. So what is your take on subnationalism and nationalism?
Yeah, I think that subnationalism is a reality of India. I think even Mr. Modi realizes that, and so therefore the thing changes. So, I mean, as is well known that subnational identities in India is the reason why even the BJP is going to find it very difficult. I think most people will agree on one thing, that the chances that the BJP's seats will increase or vote share will increase in this election are extremely low. So the BJP's rise also has been checked by subnationalism already. That result we know. And the BJP itself is going to, most probably, if it comes back to power, will have to rely much more on sort of regional parties to form the next government. So that, for me, tells you that subnational identities in India are much stronger than national identities.
Mr. Luthra?
Yeah, hi, Ruchir. Ruchir, you obviously have a very precise, incisive mind. Can you tell us two things this government has done perfectly or near perfectly, and two things they've been lousy about?
See, the two lousy things we can sort of say very easily about, which is that I was a big critic of demonetization the day it happened. in terms of what happened. And my single biggest disappointment, as far as the government is concerned, has to do with the fact that the withdrawal of the state, the fact that there's the word privatization is taboo. There's been absolutely no withdrawal of the state from the economic sphere. For me, those have been the two big disappointments. The two positives, as far as I will say, is the fact that one, I think, has to do with at least the attempts made to try and clean up India, in terms of giving toilets, giving that, in terms of what has happened in India. At least the attempt has been made to try and sort of clean India up. And the second thing I will say is the fact that the perception amongst people about corruption in general at the central level is not that like that sort of heavy as it was with the previous governments. So those to me are the two positives in terms of perception, and the two negatives which I've said. So hopefully that sort of
Amy?
Hi, Ruchir. I'm Amy Kasman from the Financial Times. I wanted to ask you, I know you've been out on the road and everyone's focused on who will win. I want to ask you what you see as the challenge facing the next government, whoever it will be, in terms of getting India's economy back on track in a world that's going through deglobalization, where the kind of potential for export-led growth as a development model, which has been followed by all of East Asia, seems to maybe not be that viable for India. What do you think India needs to do? What needs to be the agenda? And what is like the model for India for, reaching middle-class status?
So my biggest fear with India today, Amy, has to do with competitive populism. I really fear that is something which the next government, will have to grapple with, because so many promises have been made, and at a time when the economy is not growing that well, the temptation to do something on that is incredible. So the single biggest check you have to do is competitive populism. I mean, one sort of stat is that the amount that China spent on building their infrastructure at this stage of their development as a share of their GDP is 3 times larger than what India spends. So that is the challenge, that how do you sort of give people the basics as far as their lives are concerned, compared to spending so much on one scheme after another scheme. There's another sort of stat I quote in this book, which somebody gave me, in fact, that do we know that the government of India, till date, does not know how many centrally sponsored schemes are actually in motion? There's some estimates, I was told that they have counted, there are more than 1,000 schemes which are centrally government sponsored or centrally government aided, and they're still counting. When the audits were done. So you keep launching one scheme after another scheme after another scheme after another scheme without quite stopping to check what is it that that this scheme is achieving. So for me, that's the single biggest reason, that if you want that in a world that, yes, because of deglobalization, you can't export your way to prosperity that the way you once could, but at least sort of, you can still learn some right lessons in terms of that you got to build the roads and the infrastructure first before you build a social safety net. That's what China and other East Asian countries did.
The question here in the third row.
Okay, Ruchir, now this is picking up on the fact that you were very
Please
precise.
introduce yourself.
I'm Kishore Desai.
Yes. Yeah.
So basically, since you're so very precise with your answers, I want to know, since it's Modi versus the rest, how many people, how many parties do you expect in the Mahagathbandhan? If it ever takes place, is it going to be 5, 10, 20, 23, or 28? How many do you expect?
That the BJP itself, the number of allies the BJP has already, I think is like 15, 20 allies the BJP already has? 39. There we go, Sanjay says that. So the fact is that we, in a way, it already has those many.
Okay.
So I'd say this issue of this being a single party, and the fact that like in this election, as you know, that the BJP has conceded more seats in Bihar, in Maharashtra to its allies than it did last time. So the BJP itself realizes, I think, that coalition is the way for this country. And the Mahagathbandhan, how many, it depends on the entire seat makeup. But the fact that the BJP already has more than 30 allies tells you that no matter what happens, you will have a Mahagathbandhan on both sides.
No, but Ruchir, for instance, in Bihar,
Yes.
the BJP conceded as many as 17 seats out of 40
Yes.
to Nitish. But not a single poster, not a single hoarding in Bihar carries Nitish's photo or name. It
Yes.
is only Modi.
Yes.
So it's the BJP may have tied up with 40 parties, but that really doesn't tell you much.
I know, but
Because
I'm
it's
saying
the
that-
terms of alliance.
Yes, but let's assume that our group forecast is correct, hypothetically, which I don't think it will be, but let's assume. So if the BJP gets, let's say, 215 seats or something like that, most likely it will form the next government, I think what most people will say, but it will need many more allies to do that. We will see as to then how that government will be run. Can it still be run as the way a government today is being run with one person and a very centralized, prime minister's office? I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Yeah, so in that context, you wrote somewhere that leaders change over years, and,
Yes.
and you met Putin, I think, in 2001, and then again in 2010, and,
Yes.
and he was a different Putin.
Totally.
Do you see Mr. Modi changing? If your prediction comes true and he comes back at the head of a larger alliance government?
I have no idea which way it can change, right? In terms of, because Putin also, like the way it changed as far as Putin's concerned is an anecdote that I've quoted quite often, that, 2001, 2002, when you first met him, I think people forget this. Both Putin and Erdogan, when they first came to power, seriously focused on the economy. They really want to get the economics correct. Once the economy started booming, then then their attitudes began to change. So in 2010, I've spoken about this. I mean, I can briefly tell you about this sort of anecdote that in 2010, it was October 2010, and Russia's economy was still doing well because it was growing a lot because oil prices were above $100 a barrel, and he had sort of overseen this incredible boom. So I was going to Moscow to address a rally, not a rally, this is a political mode, to address a conference. But I guess that's a Freudian slip, but let's talk about it. So I was going to Moscow to basically speak at a conference. Putin then was the prime minister. His office called me up and said that since you're coming, the prime minister would really like you to sort of present here about what your frank thoughts are on Russia. So I took that advice okay, I said, I'm going, I'll do that. So I took the word frank very seriously. Like, he wants frank advice, I'll give him frank advice. So off I went to the Moscow Convention Center, and I came up on stage to speak. Putin was sitting here, and I think it was Christine Lagarde who was sitting here, just like Anant is sitting, and I sort of went up on the dais to speak, and I had prepared a very frank presentation. And I started off by saying that, listen, when Putin first came to power, the economy was in a complete mess, and this is what he's done to improve the economy. He was a free market reformer. He cut taxes a lot. He integrated the Russian economy with the rest of Europe and kept saying, I want to make Russia more like Europe. That was what his entire mantra was. I said, that's great, sir. But today, 10 years later, with oil prices where you are, here are your problems, which is that you have no small and medium-sized enterprises. You have absolutely no, it's completely no checks on corruption, blah, blah. I went on. I did not know that this is being telecast live in terms of it, and the Russian TV was carrying it, basically, as far as I was concerned. I finished my speech. I went and sat down there. And I thought that Putin was very nice. He was taking notes down and stuff. And then he went up to sort of, to speak as well. And he spoke in Russian, but it seemed to me as if he was acknowledging some of the stuff that was said there. I said, well and good. But you could make out a bit of tension in the room. I left back for the hotel room. Next morning, I was woken up very early in the morning with somebody asking me, calling me from New York, the office people, what have you done? So I said, what have I done? So basically said that, don't you read the Russian press? I said, no, I don't read the Russian press. I don't read Russian. So basically said the Russian state-owned press has decided to completely go after you with saying that who needs your money, who basically, so they've come here to spoil the party, you're welcome to go home. I was advised to leave the country and I've never gone back since. So I think that it showed to me how much Putin had changed over time because of what had happened as far as he's concerned. Which way Modi could change it? As a second-term prime minister, I don't know. Will he sort of all of a sudden become more of an economic reformer? Or will he become even more of a statist, thinking that, again, it depends on the numbers, that if I've got that if I've been re-elected, why change what I've done in the first term.
Ishwarji?
Hi.
Hi, Ruchir. This is Ishar Aluwalia. You mentioned that Indian corporate sector is always in favor of whichever government is in power.
Officially.
Officially,
Yes.
formally when they speak, right? Now, what about the Indian voter? Are they fearless in your wanderings and meeting the voters? Do you think that they are actually speaking their mind as to how they're going to vote? Or are the pollsters out of business and the voters have become wiser?
You know, I think it requires, so when you ask a voter a question in terms of which way you're going to vote for, their first response is almost like they smile, they blush, almost as if you've asked them a very personal question. So I think that it's not out of fear, but I think that they're very possessive about who they're going to vote for. So you have to gently get into them. But it's a very good question. Broadly, my feeling is that when you speak to voters out there, they speak your mind. The fear factor is not that huge that I find when you speak to voters. It's more about a shyness. It's more about thinking that this is their real prized possession. Why should we share this with you? What are you going to do? And yes, there's an initial skepticism because you have to explain to them कि हम पत्रकार लोग हैं, हम सिर्फ लेखक हैं, हम like हम सरकार की तरफ से नहीं. So you have to put them at ease. But once you put them at ease, I think then they are quite willing to speak their mind. The reason why pollsters, like in India, have such a tough time is because of the heterogeneity of this country. I think that's the real reason, rather than a fear factor. And pollsters know how to discount this stuff. Like one thing which I think is there, that typically in this country, like this is, I think that, like coming from some of the pollsters in our group have told us that typically about polls show that about 15% of Muslims say that they vote for the BJP. But when pollsters actually do their numbers, they heavily discount that number in terms of what they think is the actual number. So I think that they know, but the reason why pollsters find it so difficult to call is just, as I said, 1% vote swings, 15 seats, and the election looks so different. How can you try and predict that when you're out there? But the voters, when they speak to you, I think as you were saying, Vandita, that their hospitality, their magnanimity, and the willingness for them to speak comes through once you just put them at a bit of ease.
And Ruchir, one of the things that I've seen, and I obviously have no data for this, but I feel like earlier, voting used to happen as families. So families vote for the same party. And now I think that might not quite be the case.
Very true, very true. And one thing we've seen
What is
remarkable
true?
over the find is...
They do vote...
No, they don't vote for families anymore.
They don't...
Yeah, so often you find that the women, voters will basically tell you now that they're voting their own way. So the rise of the women voter and the way they tell you that they're voting their own mind and stuff like that, I think that is a big change for the better that we have seen. So that's very correct. This entire idea that family voting, basically, yeah, sure, to put you off, they'll tell you sometimes, even if the election is next day, अभी देखो किसके लिए वोट डालते हैं, ऐसे चुनाव तो कल है, आप पर शाम को बैठ के हम करेंगे, but you know that they are basically not, that's the reason they're not telling you the right thing. So you have to just tell them a bit, comfort them, and then they will.
And one of the things the pollsters will struggle is because I don't think publicly the women will disagree with their families. So they'll do what they want to do in the polling booth, but they might not necessarily.
Yeah, but I think that we are that sort of change we have seen, where they're willing to tell you much more about what their viewpoint is.
Yeah. There's a question here? Yeah, please. Can I just get a sense of how many hands are coming up? Okay. All right.
Yes, of course, Uncle.
In your travels around the country, what has been the reaction of the common voter and the common man out of this rabbit which has been produced out of a hat, this myth called Nyay? Do they believe it's possible?
No. So like again, like in UP, like we roamed around, I didn't hear that word once in the entire trip. So I think that, but this is true in general, which is that both for the government and the opposition, that these kind of grand promises made just before an election do not resonate much with the public. I think so. So I said this when I had a previous exchange, that at that point in time, the government had announced a budget with a lot of SOPs in it. And I said that voters discount these things, basically. So I did not hear the word Nyay much. Or I say much. I can't remember us hearing it at all in our travels. So yeah, I think that the election is being fought, as I said, along caste lines, being fought along other lines, whether you like Modi, hate Modi, whatever your thing is. But for one scheme like this to pull an election, it doesn't happen in India. Voters discount last-minute election sops.
Can we get a mic to the first row here, please? And then the third row after that.
Hi, Deepika Margo. What about the first-time voter? Have you noticed their way of thinking? Is it different from the rest? Because there'll be a lot of first-time voters this time.
Yes. Most first-time voters we found are still, in UP at least, are still voting along caste lines. At the margin, I feel that the PM Modi, the Prime Minister has a bit of an edge here, that there are a few voters in places we went to, like last year, like in Karnataka and things. In those places, we found that there is a bias for Modi, because that's the one name they've heard a lot, and it's been effective. So in places like Karnataka and all, we found that last year when we traveled. But in UP, I found it's amazing that the first-time voter also basically is going through, is voting the caste way.
Third row here, please. Third row here, then we go to the fourth row there, please. Just wait for the mic, please, and introduce yourself.
Saeed Naqvi. Throughout your travels, the social disharmony factor on account of lynchings, on account of love jihad, on account of ghar wapsi, on account of thousands in jail without any. Does that affect the people, or is it a very esoteric concern of some of us? Does it affect?
As I said,
do you spot it there?
It's part of the polarization side. I think that it's part of the polarization, which is that the people who don't like will point to that. The people who like it think that, the people have been put.
People who like it.
Exactly. They'll tell you that the people have been put in the right place, right? And they'll point to the fact that no riots have taken place in the last 5 years, or like no major riots, like the way, and that's what's happened. So I think that it is again depending on what your leaning is. But yeah, there are people who will tell you that, listen, the positive is that because of all this, there's been, no riots have taken place, people have been put in their place. You do get those remarks as well, which are thrown at you out there. So what this is doing at a very, sort of subconscious level is very hard to detect. But having said that, I still found it remarkable that I did not, the good news of our travels was that when we would speak to a Muslim voter, I didn't find any fear that they were openly telling us who they're voting for. There was no fear where they're telling you that, in a true fair society, they will not tell you. But here, when we met those voters, they were openly telling you who they'll vote for. And for good or for bad, that at least that's a positive, right? If they're still openly telling you who they're going to vote for.
So, fourth row there, lady in the fourth, yeah.
Mr. Ruchir Sharma, I'm Nandita Bakshi. I want to ask you one thing, since you're a global investor, and you have had serious reservations about demonetization. Did you, during these 28 trips, structure your questions to check on the distress of demonetization and get to the heart of the distress, both for demonetization and the farmer? That is, as far as the people who have migrated back into the villages, causing farmer distress more because they've lost their jobs. So did you feel that distress, and do you think that will affect their voting no matter what the caste? Did you feel that?
Such a good question, because demonetization happened in November of 2016. We went on our subsequent election trip, our 25th election trip to Uttar Pradesh to cover the Uttar Pradesh election trip in March of 2017. I was very against demonetization, and I went there with that bias. And yet, what we found when we went there was that once again, it is amazing that the people who liked Modi were willing to say that it is perfectly fine with what's happened. He's trying his best to root out corruption. And the people who don't like Modi basically had the opposite to say. So I just feel that even demonetization till date is viewed along ideological lines rather than from an economic objective. So it was a very humbling experience for me, as I recount in the book, that after 2017 election trip in UP, despite the fact that we were fresh after demonetization in terms of the economic effect, it did not dent Modi's support in Uttar Pradesh.
I'll just continue this question for a second. In 2017, the impact had not settled. But in 2019, the impact has settled. The spending power has gone down. There is hardly any consumption. There is huge distress. Did you feel the voter looking at it as a concern? In 2019? No.
We went for our election in 2000 and, like our election trip in November, December of 2018. We did feel a bit of that then. You're right about that, and maybe like a delayed effect. But not a, you would expect a decision like that, which had a lot of negative economic effect, to have a very serious political consequence in this country. And I did not feel that. That is just, the reality in terms of the travels. That it didn't change voter behavior in a way you would expect to. So therefore I've said in this country, and I've said so in the book, the connection between economics and politics in India, for good and for bad, is very weak.
Good evening, Ruchir. This is Blessing George here. Couple of questions. Is the polarization here to stay, or is it just a passing fad? And Rahul Gandhi is fighting for 2019 or 2024? And any observations from the southern states?
Yeah, so I think this polarization, according to me, is here to stay. That if the election results turn out to be roughly how people are thinking today, I don't think it ends, right? Because it's basically like not a very decisive one way or the other sort of thing. So I think that this is the reality of India, the reality of the world. Even in the US today, the polarization is incredible. So I find such parallels between that. In the US today, there's a very interesting statistic which sort of stays in my head. 30 years ago, typically about 70% of Republicans would support a Republican president, 30% would support a Democrat president. Over time, how that number has gone down, that as of today, virtually zero Democrats will ever support a Republican president, and virtually zero Republicans will ever support a Democrat president. That's the extent of polarization which has taken place. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with social media. It sort of, just amplifies it in terms of the polarization which has happened, and a sign of the times. So I do not expect this election result to do anything to end polarization. Your second question, if I can... Yeah. I have no idea, what his mind is thinking about that way. In terms of it, I think that that's a, conflict that they are facing, and we saw it firsthand in UP. If they were thinking purely about 2019, I don't think Priyanka would have stood or made an entry at this point in time, if their objective was just 2019. But they obviously are thinking about 2022 assembly elections and further. So yeah, for good or for bad, I think that their election is still sort of, that they're still thinking of this not as just a 2019 election, but as something which is a bit longer.
Can the Congress party ever exist without the Gandhi last name?
Very hard. I can't see that scenario. We saw it from 96 to 98. The party is so structured that way that it's very hard to sort of do, one way or the other.
Yeah, there's a question there.
Hi, Ruchir. I am Rear Admiral Ahuja. My question is, if Balakot had not happened, the question is that, given that Balakot has happened, has that affected BJP's chances, and how much?
It's possible like it has affected it, but here's the deal, that even 1 or 2% is enough. So it's possible that the positive effect has been 1 or 2%. And so yes, I think that it has helped at the margin. But again, these narratives change so quickly that when we were there in March, we were speaking just in the wake of that. And at that point in time, it seemed that was going to be the decisive factor. Today, we can say it may be 1 of 10 factors. Please.
Hi, Ruchir. This is Ashmita Sethi. Who and what will be good for the country? Which party or which Mahagathbandhan? Yeah.
There's absolutely no way I'm going to say that, because I think that our job is to be observers, to go out there, to see what the campaign is. Yes, I do feel that given India's diversity, that to have a diverse coalition, whether it's the BJP or whoever leads it or the Congress leads it, is, I think, in the interest of this country. So I think that apart from saying that given the heterogeneity and diversity of this country, too much centralization doesn't work, it's very hard for me to sort of say which party is the better of the two. All I say is this, that, that the longer a party stays in power or a leader stays in power, then you begin to, sort of see that effect. I mean, like, you begin to see law of diminishing returns. That's what happened with the UPA as well. I mean, if Manmohan Singh had been a one-term prime minister and the UPA had been a one-term government, I think that how we would have viewed that would be very different compared to the fact that what happened in the second term.
Yeah, let me take 2 more questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Mohit Saraf. If you today, when you think there is an anti-incumbency for Modi, still he's getting 215 seats, and you mentioned about economic reforms, and we all know that there have been demonetization. You have a different view, whether IBC, RERA, a lot of other things. Some people call it structural reforms, like Margaret Thatcher. Some people say it's a flaky reform. But I think what you just mentioned, that the world press, particularly the political press, doesn't think Modi that well. And basically, there have been reforms, and I think even if you said
Sorry,
right...
I'll just ask you to get to the question,
yeah,
please.
so basically, I want to understand the conflict, that people are voting back, or maybe they're getting 215 seats, and he's done big reforms, but still the world press believes that he's not done enough. So I just want to understand the contradiction.
No, as I said, I have no idea how many seats he's going to get. I've just given you, what is the best guess at this point in time. So let's wait for the verdict before we can definitely judge that. I think that the issue here is the fact that that the reform expectations which were expected were much greater when he came to power compared to what's happened. And the world press does have a, like I've quoted to you, like even the Wall Street Journal, which, which is not about just because some of the press, you can argue, has a liberal bias, and that liberal bias comes through. But I think that the expectations of what India could do, like as I said, that even I wrote in 2014, that could this be India's Reagan moment? Did this turn out to be India's Reagan moment? Did we get the kind of economic freedom that we expected? Did we get the kind of privatizations or the withdrawal of the state that we expected? I think that is the answer.
Okay, I think there's one mic already there. We'll take one last question after that.
My name is Abhay. I just want to understand Indian politics or Indian democracy by an example. Example is Hema Malini. Her husband was given ticket by BJP before her, and he was declared in Bikaner, that was the constituency he represented after first election, wanted, missing, and he never went to the constituency and he lost next election. Then his wife came into picture in Mathura. This time I have been watching on television and newspapers. The moment she comes out from helicopter, she has to put sunglasses and then everything should be proper. Then she goes, everything is fixed, and this 2 minutes she speaks. One day she was asked to sit on a tractor. 2 different air coolers were installed on the tractor. She sat on the tractor for 2 minutes and she did some photo shoots with some cycle with grain.
Just ask you to get to the question, please. Sorry.
And someone like her also get elected. After 70 years of Indian independence, I thought Indian electorates are matured. They will vote for someone who can do something and who can do something for them. She does not do anything. She never goes to Mathura. Still, people.
So but this is the question like I've addressed in the book, that the impact of film stars in India is declining, and in fact, there are very few states, for example, where a film star can end up winning an election in terms of, or leading a political party. Only the southern states are left that way. So you've quoted one Hema Malini, but even in this election, let us see how many film stars actually...
Now her son is also there.
Yeah, but let's see how many will win. So I think that, like in India's case, the number of film stars, there are only 2 states where film stars really dominated the political discourse, right? Which was Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. In all other states in India, never has a film star been able to make a serious political impact. So, you'll have one Hema Malini or someone, but never has a political, right? I mean, so in the end, the political power in India still resides with the grassroots politician. Look at the people who have persisted. Very few, like you can count on your fingertips, how many film stars in India are able to lead a political party or win an election? There's still very few and far between. That's my, so that's my thing about the faith in democracy still.
Give the mic to Mr. Bagri, and then I'll leave it to Ruchir if you has time for one more question. He's going to do a book signing after this, so anybody is...
Hello, Ruchir. I'm Shyam Bagre. I feel this Kashmir is, of course, a big issue, everybody knows, but our other borders like Arunachal, we have a problem with, like, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Nepal. So I think a strong government with good majority should be better for the country right now, looking at the entire, our geographical issues we have. What is your take on this, please?
No, as I said that whether it's true or not is not my thing. I'm saying that the diversity, the heterogeneity of this country is such where that it's very difficult to get that kind of a government in this country. So it's a reflection of the reality. Whether it's good or bad, I don't know. It depends as to who ends up becoming that, who ends up becoming that leader. So that's your sort of way of thinking about the country, and I respect that. But I'm not sure whether the political reality will allow for that, given the diversity of this country. Yeah, sure. Last question.
Yeah. Last question, please. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Ranganathan. Ruchir, I always enjoy reading your books, and this one I have read, and I'm just, quoting one small piece from this, and I think it has a lot of potent in it. And you said India's growth rate is probably overstated, the result of dodgy new accounting methods used by the National Statistics Bureau. And do you still think that this dodgy and...
Yeah, I mean, this morning QED, right? I mean, from the reports I've seen. So, I mean, like, I made this point when we spoke before, that something didn't pass the sniff test when the GDP data was changed in 2015, and I wrote about it immediately. That how can an economy be growing at 7-8% and the growth rate be the same of the last decade? When you look at every other indicator that we look at, two-wheeler sales, cement sales, exports, those sort of growth rates in that era were 30% a year, 20-30% a year. So that it just didn't pass the sniff test. So that comment I made was in the book you're quoting to, my previous book from early 2016. And I still maintain the same thing, and I think it's become much more widely accepted today compared to back then.
Would that go for the employment data as well?
I haven't looked at it closely, but yeah, in terms of the fact that India's GDP data doesn't pass the sniff test, I think is something which I have said so right at the outset. And I said that I was surprised why this government would have even accepted it, because they accepted it in 2015 when they hadn't even completed 1 year in office. And that was a big surprise to me.
Thank you.
Okay, I think, Ruchir, you have to wrap up, or how do you feel?
I know there are lots of questions,
there are lots
but
of questions,
there are lots of people also getting anxious about sort of, just in general, but I can be here all night. We can talk about Indian politics because that's a true passion. And like for me, as I said, that it's not just the politics. This is an incredible journey of India, right? We have traveled for these, now I know that I'm speaking to people like you who have traveled much more, but to have done this in a structured, consistent way is something I feel really happy about. So for me, it's not about politics, even the book, it's a journey of India. What are the chances we would have ever been to places like Betia in Bihar, or been to places like, like Lalgarh in West Bengal, had it not been for this incredible journey? So it's a country that I can't, I travel for my work to different emerging markets, but I do this 1 week a year. I take out to do this election trip. There is absolutely nothing which excites me more than this 1 week of traveling in the heat and dust of India. There's something about this country, in the countryside, which is so seductive. So I hope you'll do this journey as well. And as I said, that the book takes you through this incredible journey of a country that I love so deeply.
And we appreciate you for... And I think we all appreciate the fact that you've put a number out there.
No, I have not put a number out there.
Your group has. Your group has. You know, the last time we had a foreign expert come here before election, 2014, we had Farid Zakaria, who did an Adda with us, and he said that Modi, after 2014, will not even emerge a regional leader, forget a national leader.
So are you telling me that's how good, you know, like, we people, I know, Farid's a very close friend of mine and someone who's also, like, watching this, but I think that this obsession with the number is natural but pointless, because having traveled this country and done so many of these election trips, I can tell you that anyone who predicts with any certainty what the number is a charlatan. I really believe that. Yeah. That there is no way of being able to predict. As I said, 1% vote swing, 1% left, 1% right, and the entire outcome looks very different. You know, my opening statement, so don't hang on to the number, but the fact is the broad direction. We know what the broad direction is in terms of which way things are moving and what are the, you know, big issues. As I said, it's an issueless election, but still what the sort of, the way the voters think, the way people are thinking. For me, that's more important. But I know every conversation these days begins with, what is your number?
Thank you, Ruchir. It was wonderful listening to you. And Anant will present a portrait to Ruchir now.
Can I quickly call Raj on stage to present the portrait? Raj Kamal Jha, Chief Editor.
And I know that, you know, we could have gone on, so I'll be there for a while to do any book signings. I mean, happy to meet all of you. Thank you. Okay, just announce that, if you don't mind. Thanks so much. That's very special. Thank you so much. We will have it sent to your house. So we'll just tell you. I'll just tell you. Yeah, we'll take care of it. Yeah, thanks so much.
The book counter is outside, so you can pick up a copy of the book and you can come and meet Ruchir and get it signed. He'll be over here.